So the way we imagine nature is important as well. This depends a lot on social selection and social reflection. Um, we often select particular features of nature to focus upon, um, and when we do that, we ignore those that do not suit our interests and worldviews that are shaped by those interests. The categories we use to comprehend nature closely also reflect categories we use to comprehend society. And nature is an inescapably social and political phenomenon. Uh, it's in the realm of power and interest that the concept of nature is ultimately constructed. This is illustrated especially through the work of Darwin, this naturalizing of capitalism. So you have to understand that at this time that Darwin's coming up with um, his ideas on natural selection, the England and much of Europe is going through an industrial revolution. The transformation of economies into a capitalist economy is happening as well. And it's not surprising that the concepts that Darwin used to explain what's happening in reference to natural selection on the Galapagos Islands marries up to the ideas in capitalism. Um, for example, Darwin discusses economic forces of capitalism, innovation, and competition as if they were pseudo-natural processes, implying that any other arrangement would be somehow unnatural. The marketplace described as a jungle in which you have to struggle to survive. Naturalization can subtly give us the sense that the current form of our economy is inevitable and that it is foolishly idealistic to think otherwise. So this is how the social universe is helping construct the scientific universe and how we understand the natural world and how we seek out to prove those understandings as well. Uh, Unfortunately, the nature of nature has found itself rooted in the realm of scientific racism. The history of naturalizing arguments by scientists attempting to prove inherent differences in the capabilities of human races is not new. It's been going on for a long time. Morton's craniometry is a good example of this. Morton was a 19th century um, scientific. He was a 19th century scientist that inspired a fad that compared cranial capacities of different races. As Stephen Jay Gould comes along later in the history of science, we find that much of Morton's measurements were uh, skewed, biased. His findings were skewed and biased. And we also find in Huntington's environmental determinism study the relationship between climate and the degree of civilization of a people. This is once again this scientific racism, this European white supremacy finding its way into the science of the day. Getting back to this idea of the environment as a social construction, um, the argument essentially is that the same process of social selection and social reflection in our understandings of nature can be seen in environmentalism itself. This view ultimately threatened the natural conscience of environmentalists and many environmental sociologists. So, by using social construction, which comes out of postmodernism, which is um, a relativist perspective, the arguments that scientists were using ultimately end up being used as an argument against their uh, thought processes, if you will. This brings us to the realist constructionist debate. Um, as we've already talked about, the social constructionists are subjectivists. They're saying that we essentially made this all up, and they're essentially denying the reality of environmental problems, which ultimately contributes to mobilization of environmental politics. This debate between realism and constructivism was a healthy debate. We now understand realism and constructionism. We understand it with roots in an age-old discussion of materialism versus idealism, and we understand it as a fundamental conceptual tension in environmental sociology and in many of the realms of sociology. We hope this leads to what we think of in reference to a critical realism, a realism that embraces the recognition that we can only understand reality by way of our own ideas. This idea of critical realism comes from Michael Carolyn and is a newer strain of theory in environmentalism. The constructionist critique of environmentalism can be seen in reference to the ozone hole versus ozone depletion. Social selection and environmental understanding, especially in reference to the ozone hole versus ozone depletion, led to a particular representation for a particular narrative purpose. There never was an ozone hole. The ozone layer was just becoming thinner. And in order to rally the world to address this problem, it was necessary to construct the problem as an ozone hole, because a hole is much more problematic than a thinning layer, and it encouraged us to respond quicker. So as you can see here, we're socially constructing the problem in such a way to create a narrative that inspires change instead of inaction. We can also see this in reference to constructing wilderness. Wilderness being the highest exemplar of what it means to be natural. It's also based on often forcible absence of and regulation of people in the natural world. Such an approach to environmental protection is based on culturally specific understanding of what the environment is and could be, which ultimately is a North American understanding. What we find is that when we forcibly remove populations, indigenous populations from areas, they might get angry and they might start doing things that are contrary to what we want to see happen in wilderness, like going and poaching elephants and tigers and things like that, when they normally would not have engaged in that type of behavior. When we think about constructing wilderness globally, in Southeast Asia, we see people and wildlife in populated areas that actually coexist harmoniously. And when we see them, we view them as living in harmony with nature. They are part of nature and beneficial to nature. By removing them from nature, you might create some problems within the natural landscape. Wilderness is, in the end, a state of mind more than a state of nature. Nature's not arguing to have humans removed from it. Humans are arguing to have humans removed for it. So we have to remember the argument that we should not universalistically and imperialistically promote such a culturally specific notion as no people in wilderness, because that perspective usually leads to a social injustice and may even undermine biodiversity, as we talked about in the earlier slide. Another way that we have constructed the human nature of nature is in reference to tourism. And when we think about tourism, we're thinking about the social construction of the landscape. Over the past 100 years, we've seen a rise in tourism related to environmentalism. Tourists come to see nature, they come to be in nature because they generally are not in places that have nature. And this idea comes from a culture of leisure. And the way tourists construct the landscape is generally much different than the way locals construct the landscape. Tourists tend to objectify the landscape, using its visual qualities as a cultural opportunity for leisure. So they're coming to the jungle to experience the jungle, whereas people that are living there have a different way of thinking about that jungle. Locals see the landscape differently, and they see its use for different purposes depending on what they do for a living in that area. Locals also tend to miss some things, like what the author refers to as ghosts of places. These ghosts of places could be based on memories of attachment to the place through the memories that you and your family experienced in that place, whereas most and those experiences have happened over time, in repetition over time, whereas most tourists are coming and they don't have that long time standing within the community. They don't have that long memory of experiences attached to a specific place. The experience of a particular landscape is important as well. We have to remember that both what we see and what we quote unquote see is political. This is all based on businesses. The businesses that are supported are usually at advantage in conflicts over landscape. So businesses, business owners, business districts generally have more sway in how the landscape is constructed, more so than locals that are working in those businesses. Tourists tend to be wealthier than local people, and tourism businesses are often backed by corporate interests and by national and regional governments eager to generate foreign exchange and tax revenues. You can see where the power and interests start to play, or how they start to play out, and who they are going to be in favor of. And a situation of inequality is particularly challenging to manage the commons democratically. It almost always is in favor of the rich and powerful. This, of course, leads to environmental exclusion. The use of the environmental arguments are extremely useful for social exclusion. They often result in redistricting and restrictive zoning policies that protect nature, but ultimately help perpetuate inequality. And of course, we see all kinds of responses to these inequalities. The most important, or the most popular, at least at this time, is the population growth arguments and how they're used to deter or stop immigration.